pleasure to be here. Really excited to be part of this conference. I will do a very brief introduction of our panelists and get into the meat of our discussion. Starting with my left here is Professor Michael Manville. He's the Assistant Professor of Urban Planning at UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. Both his research and teaching focus on the relationships between transportation, land use, and local public finance. Next to Mike is Sissy Trin. She's the founder and executive director of the Southeast Asian Community Alliance. The mission of the organization is to build and empower Southeast area communities through leadership development, education, advocacy, and organizing. Next to Trin is Brad Cox. He's the Senior Managing Director for the LA office of Trammell Crow. His focus is raising capital, ensuring projects get developed in the city of LA, and guides their investment strategy throughout Southern California. He and his team in LA have over $1.4 billion worth of investment in various stages of development. Help me welcome our panel. The focus of our panel was to try to sort of anchor the discussion around this issue of democracy at the local level. We had the other panel and Doug talk a little bit about the initiatives that are happening at the state level. But there is plenty of work and plenty of activity happening in the city of LA. We're sort of in this special moment in the city. And as former council member Wu articulated, we have numerous initiatives that are being adopted, that are being proposed, policy issues, and debates around the issue of homelessness, the issue of affordability. You got that flavor for it today, and we hear it in the papers and everywhere we practically engage in dialogue with our colleagues and neighbors. I wanted to start the discussion and talk a little bit about what that means in terms of actual impact and progress around the development of housing. And in particular, I wanted to talk to our panelists and pose a question related to the propositions and measures that have been adopted, not by council, but by the voters. And whether governing by proposition is good for democracy and good for policymaking in the city of LA. We know that with Measure JJJ, we have a set of policy objectives through TOC guidelines for the development of housing that's really in its infancy, so we're really trying to assess what the impact of that is. But in relation to the work that's being done at the ballot box, we know that in the city of LA, in the last election, only less than 12% of registered voters, not eligible voters, registered voters actually voted, either in support or against these measures. What does that mean to representative democracy, right? When you have a lot of low-income families, a lot of undocumented immigrants, a lot of young people that are entirely disenfranchised from the political process. So I wanted to sort of anchor the discussion in that topic, considering the theme of the conference. And maybe start with Mike. What is your reaction to that? What's your response? How can you make this discussion a bit controversial? And I'll turn to Brad.
I'm glad you got the lead on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I sat in the wrong place. So there seems like there's two parts to that. I mean, one part of the question was, how should we feel about this, the direct democracy mechanism of, that we vote on oftentimes very complicated things, sort of just you go down to your polling place and you have in mind who you're going to vote for president, and then you're presented with Measure S or JJJ or like these very long multi-part initiatives, and then you sort of check it or yes or no. And I think there's pitfalls to that. I think that the typical voter, through no particular fault of their own, is not terribly well informed just because they have a lot of demands on their time. And so it's one thing for them to keep track of a mayor's election or a governor's election or a presidential election, or take cues from, they know that they're a Democrat, so they're going to vote for Hillary Clinton, and so that's not a big informationally demanding exercise. It's another thing to look at of a 20 or 40, or in the case of Measure S, 77-page proposition that's summarized in a tiny ballot and make really an informed decision about that could have very long-lasting effects. So I think that's the downside of that, in addition to what you mentioned about a lot of folks just aren't able to vote, is that we end up, well, put it this way, part of the justification of representative government is that you have people who are paid to make informed decisions, right? And so they can take the time to deliberate complex issues and then, on behalf of their constituents, arrive at a good decision. And so you do run the risk of losing a lot of that nuance and losing a lot of that information when it's just like, hey, do you want to, build a better Los Angeles or relieve traffic or things like that. The representation issue is just a bigger issue across the board, right? I mean, so that we can worry that people don't turn out to vote in these special elections for propositions, but at the same time, if people aren't turning out to vote in large numbers for their city council members, then it's fair to wonder if the city council members are going to be representative of their entire district too. I mean, the problem of participation in American politics is it's there, right? I mean, there's been different proposals to solve it, but it's kind of above my pay grade. So
before we turn to Brad, I think related to your comments, Mike, talking to Sissy, you were instrumental in promoting and ultimately getting adopted the CASP, which is the Cornfield Arroyo Specific Plan. The prior panel talked about, I think, and rightly identified this issue related to comprehensive planning. And the fact that we have 35 community plans out there, 2 of which are in the process of getting updated, 1 of which was approved by council and is now in its 3rd year of litigation, CEQA litigation, by the way. And there's no end in sight in when that ultimately gets adopted. I think of community plans as truly a way of increasing community engagement and really thinking about planning for the future and trying to avoid these kinds of spot zonings, these kinds of variances, these kinds of one-off developments that legitimately concern community. So can you talk a little bit about this issue around how we can engage community, how that intersects with the democratic process, and whether or not specifically your work on the CASP has been able to yield some good results?
Okay. So just to give folks a little bit of background about what CASP is and what it does, it's a specific plan that covers about 660 acres between the Chinatown and Heritage Square Gold Line stations. And so it was the city's first attempt at creating a transit-oriented district, right? Moving away from segregated land uses to more mixed-use, high-density development centered around transit. And so the original plan actually upzoned and removed parking minimums and instead placed parking maximums, all without any sort of consideration around issues of equity. And so for those of you who don't know, Chinatown is the 2nd poorest neighborhood in the city of LA. Median household income is about $19,000 a year, which effectively means that our families are 1 rent increase away from becoming homeless, right? And so when we got involved in the plan, we had a lot of concerns, right? Because we knew it was going to gentrify our neighborhoods and potentially increase the number of families that we work with that are homeless. And the city saw us as NIMBYs, the standard NIMBYs that are always against density and always against progress and all this other stuff. And we were like, no, we're not. We just have legitimate concerns. And no matter how often we would say that, they just kind of dismissed us outright as NIMBYs. And so a lot of times people, when they talk about neighborhood opposition, they kind of create this broad brush stroke as to like who is against it. If you're against it, then you're against progress and you're against change. And for us, it was, we're not against density. It's just that in our neighborhood, there's a lot of hidden density, right? So we have a lot of families who are 9 people to a 1 bedroom. And so they saw density as we're going to increase rent prices, which means we're going to have to live even more severely overcrowded housing or end up on the streets, right? And again, the argument was, but this is good for the city, right? And this is the wave of the future, without acknowledging that Chinatown's already a transit-oriented neighborhood, right? There's already a lot of mixed-use development that has existed for almost 100 years. It's just never been the kind that's been appealing to young millennials, who want to flee the suburbs, right? We did a survey a few years ago and found that almost 30% of residents actually walk to work, right? So if you think about all of those different elements that already exist, independent of city planning and independent or in spite of city efforts. And so we just kept arguing and they were just not hearing it. And so fortunate for us, we brought in some experts, public counsel, Joan Ling, and then some of our allies, in Act LA that Ann had talked about earlier. So like SAGE, ELAC, and created our own version of the plan, right? Mind you, we're a youth group and we know nothing. So that's why we were really fortunate to have the support of all these experts come in. And so some of the things that we kind of ended up on was, how do we make sure that new developments benefit our communities, right? And that was one of the things when I was talking to Diego Cardoso, who was on the Planning Commission at the time, he just assumed we were anti-development and anti-change, right? And when I said, no, we can support change and we can support density if we can see that it benefits our communities, he had to do a double take. He was like, wait, what are you saying? Like, you're not against? Like, he didn't believe me at first because he was so used to that frame of if you're against a plan, if you're against change, then you're automatically in this kind of regressive state. And so when I told him we actually had our own version of the plan that had been developed in partnership with Joan and Yasmin Tong and all these other experts, he was like floored and became our biggest advocate, right? And so for us, it was like we created the super density bonus program. The idea that you could get up to 125% density with the inclusion of affordable housing. But the difference too that was unique about CASP was that we were talking about not just affordable housing for the 30 to 60% AMI, but for the first time ever in the city's history, extremely low income incentives. Because the thing is that was one of the things we were struggling with too, was we could push for all this affordable housing and still gentrify our neighborhood, right? And push out our families. And so for us, the bottom line was, we will accept density and change if we can have an extremely low income incentive program, which was what Joan helped us to develop, right? And all of a sudden that kind of really changed how we were seen when all of a sudden we were adding to the elements of the plan. And in some, to some sectors, we were like, oh, they're making the plan even better? And that was really how it all changed. And so I think what was the takeaway for us was really, and this whole conversation around, do we have too much democracy? It's that we should be leaning in and going deep into democracy and understanding that there are the NIMBYs who are just, you're never gonna change their minds. They have all kinds of preconceived notions and they're never gonna budge, right? It's like the climate deniers, the anti-vaxxers, and then there's a certain segment of NIMBYs. And then there are the ones who have legitimate concerns, right? And if you can address those legitimate concerns, they will be your biggest proponents, because that's what happened to us. When we started out as the biggest NIMBYs, but because the city was willing to address our concerns, now we're one of the biggest proponents of high density development in the city, right? Our program, the work we did in CASP, laid the foundation for the TOC program in JJJ. And so that's why it's really important to understand those distinctions and to really listen to people and to engage them in the process.
So thank you, Sissy. So Brad, you are, other than Doug, the only developer that is featured in the symposium, which I think is interesting. So somebody that's actually doing the work in the context of what we've been discussing in terms of the local level with the city, with the linkage fee, with the new Quimby fee, with the new regulations related to these measures that have been adopted by the electorate. How do you see that playing out in the sort of the real world, in your world, around these projects? Sort of trying to think through whether that actually improves the iterative process for your development in relation to community input, and does it make it more effective?
Well, I think there's a number of interesting points that have been brought up in the panels today. One is, I think the message that Zev really drove home to everybody today was communication, communication, communication is critically important. I want to pull off of Michael's point, the citywide ballot initiatives I'm not a fan of. That's really special interests that are out there boxing to really drive home their own special interest in their own goals. We have very low voter turnouts, so it's really not representative of the city on a broad-based contextual standpoint. And then you look at, as Sissy said, what's most important is the local community and making sure that as we update the community plans throughout the city of Los Angeles, we are addressing the issues that are most important to the local residents of those specific plan areas. So throw out the ballot initiatives. I think they've just create more cumbersome regulations for all of us. The local hire provisions that are part of JJJ are really hard to meet, candidly, within the 5-mile radius. The unionization of stick frame construction is a real challenge in this city. The bulk of workers that work within the stick frame industry are non-union open shop, and those teams that I like to use the analogy that we're big in union. I have over $1 billion worth of union projects going, but in the stick frame industry, you have to think of the history of that business. These are teams of lath and plasterers, of drywallers, of carpenters, of plumbers, electricians that have worked as a team forever. There'll be 5 to 10 people that will bid on a project as part of a subcontractor bid. They've worked together as a team. They're very efficient. They meet schedules, they meet budgets, and they're very well paid. They don't like to go into a union shop under the union because the union then parcels them out to various projects. They don't have the choice to move out as a team and work together. So as a result of that, there's very limited number of subcontractors that bid on these projects, and your price increase is anywhere from 20 to 30% on a union stick frame job. So I bring that up because that's just one of the challenges that was created by JJJ on a citywide initiative that we now have to comply with. If you look at the solution out there, it's us. We like to say we're a community-based developer, which we are. We have a project in Compton that we entitled 60 acres we bought. It was a 1 million square foot development. We had 46 community meetings in a 9-month period. We personally, our team walked over 350 homes, knocking on doors to receive approval of the project. Those are the type of outreach that's very important because you're listening to the community, the issues that Sissy brings up, so that you're being responsive to both their needs and their desires. And unfortunately, in the world that we live in, not a lot of developers do that. So those that really follow the rules, those that really do the hard groundwork for community relationships, get tagged with those that don't follow that process. And unfortunately, LA is it's a huge community. And part of the goal of any council person today is to make sure that as a developer that you've touched all of your local community through your outreach programs to ensure that the development that you're going to be building has listened to the community, is sensitive to the community, and is sensitive to the councilman's goals and objectives.
I grew up in the era of Prop 187, of 209, of 21, 22, right, to create a very exclusionary California. However, as someone who was actively involved in JJJ, the reason we went the ballot measure route was there was no political will. We've been working for 3 years trying to get it passed through City Hall, through the legislative process, and we're just getting no movement. And so JJJ was just like nobody likes ballot measure campaigns, but we do it as kind of as an alternative, right? And so now everybody's like, TOC is great. But when we were doing the rounds in City Hall, people were like, So.
And then we have the recent proposed measure to abolish the state laws restricting rent control. The argument is that we want more local control in that, and AIDS Healthcare Foundation is now a proponent of that, which was a proponent of Measure JJJ, and
against JJJ,
a proponent of Measure S, right. That luckily failed, and then I was just disenchanted to see Eric Garcetti stand at the dais with Michael Weinstein joining forces. It was like Thor joining forces with his evil brother, it was just jarring. But another sort of measure, right? And in terms of, I want to turn to Mike, in terms of thinking through these new propositions that are now being implemented, and you being a data-driven academic, where do you see that actually going back to the sort of results? Do you have concerns about whether or not those new measures will actually result in an increase in housing stock? We talked about Ann's number in terms of 1,900 units being proposed. We know that in the county of LA, we actually need 500,000 affordable housing units just to meet current demand. What's your prediction?
I think I'm too smart to make predictions. I'm not smart in a lot of ways, but I don't want to make a prediction. But I guess what I would say is that I agree that the initial numbers from transit-oriented communities are very encouraging. At the same time, you know, the overall numbers of just sort of units being permitted aren't up a tremendous amount, and for a lot of this year they were down, compared to the year before. And it's hard to know, you know, in the space of a few months what's actually driving that. I mean, I think if you were sort of a regulation skeptic, you could say it could be a combination of some other aspects of JJJ or the linkage fee or whatever, or you could just say the market it's a little volatile or you're into the cycle or something like that, and it's a little too early to tell. I guess one concern I would have that's broader, and this isn't a prediction, is just that, as you mentioned, we have this huge need for all sorts of housing. Right, I'll disagree with the statement made by my Luskin colleague earlier today that we just have an affordable housing crisis. I mean, we have a housing crisis. Right? Full on, we need housing of all sorts. And that's particularly, I think you can see that very plainly when you see that we've never had a lot of subsidized affordable housing. Right? There's nothing new about the fact that we have a deficit of that. What's different is that we used to be able to house lower income people in some market rate housing, right? And we can't do that anymore because now the typical, you know, apartment built in 1985 rents for a small fortune, right? It's that pressure coming from people who want to move here, from children leaving their homes at the millennial generation, and they're moving into their own places, and they're driving up the price of our existing stock. For us to meet the needs of, you know, all the affordable housing units that we do need to have, because we do need to ramp up production, like, we can't do that through a building permit process. What I mean is that, like, we're never going to successfully run a welfare state that's triggered when someone pulls a building permit, right? Like, if we really want to subsidize housing for low-income people, and I think we do, we need to have a bigger commitment to that than just like, when some developer decides they want to build something, we're going to make them build a few units. Right? You can argue that it's not fair to developers, and a lot of people don't like developers, and so maybe that's not convincing. But I think what is convincing is it just doesn't produce a lot of affordable housing. Because places that aren't affordable because they don't have a lot of housing. And so if your solution is that you're going to build subsidized units when someone goes to build housing, that's self-defeating. Right? So I think that, like, what we need to do, I mean, the trouble with some of these programs is that, and I'll set aside HHH, which I think was a great model initiative. But some of the others, like the underlying message that it conveys is that, one, housing development is somehow part of our problem. And two, affordable housing or subsidized housing is very, very important, but not so important that I as a voter will personally pay for it. Right? It's so important that I'll make some developer pay for it. But I think we should have a commitment that we all pay for it. Right? Because that's going to get us where we need to go a lot farther. So I think the more we rely on mechanisms like this, the more disappointed we're going to be, and the more we're going to sort of institutionalize in our rhetoric and in our laws that, like, helping low-income people get housing is actually just someone else's problem.
Right, I think that's thank you for that, Mike. I do think that is sort of the risk that we have in talking about these issues in two ways. One is the focus is on housing, and in my view, housing is just one component of a healthy community, number one. Number two is that we, like you indicated, think that by taxing or by creating these additional development fees related to any housing that's being created is a solution. And I wonder what, you know, our other panelists think about that. Maybe, Sissy, we can go, and then Brad can give the counterpoint. No, I'm just kidding.
No, it's not a counterpoint.
Sissy, you want to start?
So I think what Michael says is very smart, and also I will call bullshit. And I say that because the thing is that our housing system is a mess, right? We all know that. And so we have all these Bandaid solutions because we don't have the ability to envision a properly functioning system, right? And to say that we all have to pay for it, like, if I were to collect $1 from everybody in this room, like we could build nothing, right? But the thing is, if we have a system in place, right, where we can have like everybody pay, and when I say everybody, oftentimes when I hear is like you pay and you pay and you pay, as opposed to the systems, right? The level of capital that a corporation like Trammell Crow has versus, you know, a bunch of people in a room or everybody at UCLA, the scale, we have to bring in the corporate partners to be able to take our solutions to scale, right? And to presume that every individual has to chip in their piece, we're never gonna solve that problem. Sort of like when we talk about climate change, right? If all of us reduce our carbon footprint, yay, that's great, but the thing is, that's not gonna do anything compared to if we just regulate shell, right? And so it's the same with housing, right? It's like these larger players and these larger systems that are creating the problem in the first place, right? And regulating, you know, a related companies or any of those, you know, equity partners, Airbnb, you know, that's going to have more of a difference than like me chipping in $5 here or even $100 on my property tax bills. But also, you know, there's a lot of efforts. There's a couple different efforts on the ballot that are coming up to expand Prop 13, right? So we're kind of like on the one hand saying chip in here, but then on the other hand taking away money and revenue over here. And so we have to bring in the corporate players. And yeah, I would love to have a conversation about how to reform the entire system, but we just don't have the political will.
So I promised a lively debate. So Mike and then Brad.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess I disagree. And maybe we're just not understanding each other. But I think that yes, there is a lot of capital in a company like Trammell Crow or other big developers, but big developers are a tiny share of our housing market. Like most of the housing in the market right now is already built. Like every year, new development accounts for a very small proportion of the total amount of land value.
0.6% of existing inventory on new construction.
Okay, 0.6, 1%, whatever.
Less than 1%.
So most of the capital in our housing market is sitting in existing structures. Most of that capital right now is unearned wealth. If you bought a house 15 years ago and like did nothing, today it is worth so much more money, right? And so it's easy to say we need to go after the big developers, the evil developers, they have all this money and they're profiting off it. But like if you just look across the west side, there are people who are making huge windfall profits, right? And at that windfall profit, the flip side of that is the renters' housing crisis. They're both driven by the housing scarcity in our region. And I think to leave that untouched in the name of when someone does propose some new housing, we hit them with a $12 per square foot fee isn't just sort of inappropriate, but it leaves so much money on the table.
Well,
I completely disagree with the idea that you are going to make more money off a linkage fee, which its proponents suggest will get you $100 million, than if you just taxed every parcel in Los Angeles $2 a day, which would probably get you $600 million.
Prop 13.
So Brad, we'll turn it over to you.
Prop 13.
You
That's
kind
the
of
barrier.
go back to the history of Los Angeles, and you look, we were built as a horizontal city. We were not a densified city, and we've become one of the great urban markets of the world. We're an urban city now. We had 37,000 people moved to the city of Los Angeles last year. If you look at our existing housing stock, think about our average price is well north of $600,000. How many people can afford a house? So, okay, what's my solution for housing? I'm going to go to multifamily. I need to find an apartment. We have 880,000 apartment units in the city of Los Angeles. 80% of those were built pre-1978 before rent control came in, so they're under rent control. City of Los Angeles. Last 40 years, we built, on average, 4,300 new units of multifamily product. 4,300. 2017 was a record year, 12,000 units. And as I mentioned just a minute ago, our inventory and new construction is less than 1% of existing inventory. So we're never, ever going to catch up to the 500,000 units we have under our current plans, our current policies, our current procedures, irrespective of affordable. You then look at the stats of people that live at home. Between 18 and 24-year-olds, over 60% of 18 to 24-year-olds live at home in the city of Los Angeles per the last census. Over 61% between 61% 18 to 24. The 18 to 32 numbers, this drops down to about 40%. So the other number that I throw out there for everybody is that over 40% of 18-year-olds don't have driver's license in the city of Los Angeles. So where's the future of jobs going to be in 2025? 3 out of 5 workers in the city of Los Angeles are millennials. What does that mean? Well, we have $125 billion of mass transit that we're building in the city of county of Los Angeles, the largest public infrastructure project in the United States. So workers are going to be around mass transit. Density needs to be around mass transit, and we need to densify less than 4% of our city land around those transit corridors and build big. And part of that then creates the opportunity to build affordable housing as part of it, because the SB 1818 doesn't give you enough incentive to build the type of affordable housing that is required in the city of Los Angeles to meet our demand. So think about back in 1940 when we built Park La Brea. Radical move at the time, 140 acres bought by Metropolitan Life. They built 4,400 units of housing, 18 towers at Park La Brea. It was considered a monumental housing solution for the city of Los Angeles in an urban environment. It was the largest, and still is, the largest single urban development in the West Coast of the United States. That's on 140 acres of land. So think about, you take half, and there are a lot of large parcels owned by the county and the city where you can densify those that are within mass transit to build big and meet the affordable housing and the community goals, I think, that are necessary for the future of the city.
So again, I'm not against density, right? But how it actually works and plays out on the ground is where I get confused and cranky. We built all these new units in Hollywood around the Red Line station, and over the course of 20 years, we saw an increase in density and a decrease in population, right? And an increase in the number of cars because we didn't tie it to affordability, right? And so then with the CASP, we gave developers a ton of incentives, right? The super density bonus program, parking reductions, expedited zoning. There's a number of projects that are coming in that are all luxury, wildly overparked, right? And they're asking for zone changes and general plan amendments, even though they got the mixed use zoning and all these things that developers say they want, right? It's like, we want certainty, we want this. No, you want to increase your return on investment and your return on equity. And that's what's happening, right? There's this one project, like a block away from the Chinatown Gold Mine station, and it's like 1,800 parking spaces, right? They could have gone the CASP route, right? Expedited zoning and all this other stuff, but because they would rather just have all luxury. And so I agree with you that we need to build around transit, but if we don't have the affordability.
No, I'm 100% with you on the parking. The parking should be reduced, and that should be then those dollars equated into affordable housing.
But the thing is, these developers are not taking the parking reductions. They're
no question.
Yeah.
Don't disagree. The city needs to implement policy to address that issue.
Right. And so having that affordability as a requirement is the only way we're going to densify and increase our transit usage. If we just do it around density, what we're seeing in Hollywood is luxury units, condos where people want to live near transit because they like all the amenities, right? Having a Trader Joe's nearby, a cafe, a yoga studio. They don't really use the transit.
So Sissy, in the CASP, I want to get back to the issue of CEQA, because we always, it's a third rail, and we kind of touched on that a little bit in the prior panel. Under the CASP, so long as you're consistent with the underlying, sort of regulations in the CASP, you're exempt from CEQA, because there was a comprehensive EIR, goes back to comprehensive, sort of analysis and planning. I'm wondering if there, as we wait for the state legislature to fix CEQA, I will be retired. I wonder if there are I want to sort of talk about kind of the gaps in our discussion today, in your various expertise and the work that you do. What are the solutions? Are there other things, maybe, Brad, we can start with you, or in other jurisdictions, you don't just work in LA. Are you finding local government finding different solutions to that issue, to perhaps, create greater defensibility for your projects? Right now, I just heard yesterday and confirmed that the permanent supportive housing ordinance just got challenged. What was the challenge? It was a CEQA challenge. What are you seeing?
Well, the simple
yeah.
solution, CEQA is never going to change. It's never going to go away. There's too many special interests that really appreciate and will use that as an offensive or defensive tactic, no matter, it's just not going away. So what needs to happen is to set up a post-approval process for review of any CEQA challenges, and that needs to be on an expedited basis. The fact that we have to get challenged by some extortion agency that's out, there's a number of law firms out there that are basically extortionists, that they are challenging CEQA in order to earn settlement fees. That's very similar to what happened under ADA. There's a lot of firms out there that are ambulance chasers that challenged ADA regulations just to earn settlement fees.
Mike, whether CEQA or other sort of proposal that you might be thinking about, what's sort of missing from this discussion around these issues of expediting development, of maybe promoting additional housing?
I mean, I think you can always, there's all sorts of things you can come up with that would help expedite development. And I think part of the problem is that as long as there's just sort of underlying community opposition, you can remove one barrier and then another one does materialize. I mean, I won't go into it. Well, I just say, I mean, I'll join in with the other two. A lot of my research is on parking minimums and parking requirements and parking maximums, and I think that they're a big barrier to doing the kind of infill and so forth that we want to do. But I think one thing that I want to emphasize is that, I mean, one of the problems in Los Angeles and in large parts of LA County is that we've really taken off the table any increases in density in large parts of the region, right? And so that it's just, depending on how you calculate it, either 50% of the total land or 70% of the land zone residential in Los Angeles is just R1. It's single-family homes, detached single-family homes. And like, because we don't really touch that, then we do get into some of these situations that I think Sissy was talking about, where you have these conflicts where someone pays very high land values and they go in and they build very high-end units in an area full of very low-income people, and there's legitimate concerns about, does this fit the community? Is it going to displace people, and so on and so forth? If a development was like that was on the west side, where lots of people want to live and where lots of jobs are, it would probably lower rents in the neighborhood, right? It would probably sort of bring down the average cost. And there's still transit near there too. And so I think we've painted ourselves into a bit of a corner, because if you look at a build zoom map of like the last 20 years of development in LA, there's just these huge areas where we don't build. And then there's small areas where we build like 50 and 100 units, right? Steel frame construction, very expensive. And we could get very helpful density that would reduce housing costs and would still sort of accommodate non-automobile moving around with sort of like fourplexes and sixplexes and so forth, if we were just willing to say that more of our land could be used at that slightly higher level of efficiency. So I think a lot of the conflict could be avoidable if we didn't have this mindset that like, well, no, the development just has to go in this small pocket of places that is disproportionately occupied right now by low-income people.
Sissy, any thoughts on CEQA reform at the local level, or these issues around improving the process?
As someone who's actually participated in a campaign that kind of used CEQA to stop a project, this was the Chinatown Walmart, I'm not a proponent of getting rid of it. I think also working in a community where we've had to deal with a lot of the scars of having to take one for the team, essentially, and doing what's good for the rest of the city. If you think about the original Chinatown being demolished to make way for Union Station, the fact that the first freeways in the country cut through our neighborhoods, and then of course we're down the hill from Chavez Ravine. I caution the whole idea of like streamlining, right? I think again, I go back to, as an organizer, as not an attorney, digging deep into engaging communities, right? And I'm really encouraged by like the United Way's efforts around the Everyone In campaign, because for me, it's really about empowering the people who can see, and I'm not just talking about like the YIMBYs on the west side telling low-income people of color on the east side what to do, right? But I am talking about how to create these plans that allow for local residents and local stakeholders to be able to feel like they have a stake in the process, right? Because when you empower them, they drown out, right? The folks who are the NIMBYs, right? When we brought in our high school students to talk about like floor area ratios and density, right? These are like 15-year-old kids learning and teaching each other about like land use and zoning, right? It became a different conversation because it was like, this is important to them. And this is like, how do we say no to a bunch of high school kids, right? And so then it became a shift in how the debate happened, right? It wasn't like these NIMBYs and these outsiders, these West Side YIMBYs, right? It became like, maybe there's a third path, right? And so that's how we were able to kind of talk to our neighborhoods about how density could be a good thing because it increases the opportunity for affordable housing and decreases your individual housing density, right? Because it decreases the overcrowding in a neighborhood.
I wanted to circle back and maybe end with the topic of this issue around elected officials. I was struck by Mike's comments, Councilmember Wu, the sort of suggestion that so long as you have a big district and you can isolate, the sort of controversial project in one low voting constituent, neighborhood, or so long as you do the controversial project, early part of your term, and not at the end of your 4-year term. Or Zev talking about making that phone call to the business, community so that he can get and negotiate support for a single project. It's hard not to be disillusioned about that in many ways. And the question I want to pose to you all, as experts in your field, how do you hold our elected officials accountable?
Could you float an easier question? No, I mean, I'm a big fan of the Weiner approach and the Weiner bills at the state level. Really am. I just think that we have to force our local officials to make hard decisions, and I don't think we have enough leverage to force them to do that. We have 15 council fiefdoms in the city of Los Angeles. We have a mayoral system that really doesn't have a lot of power and influence other than setting budget and appointing, department heads. So there's really not that strong influence for them to make really, really hard decisions. And there's very organized organizations like Sissy and her efforts, and they are entitled and they should have full due because they are residents of the community, and everybody in the community should be engaged in the decisions that we make. But I do think that you have to have this overriding hammer there that says, look, you need to meet your housing guidelines and goals. Otherwise, we're going to step in as the big brother and meet those guidelines and goals for you. And that includes affordable housing and meeting our housing goals and needs, because a lot of the cities just don't want to deal with it. It's easier to say no than it is to make the hard decisions.
Okay. Sissy?
Let's see, where do I start? Overturn Citizens United, public funding of campaigns. I have a long list. But while I understand, it's this delicate balance, right? Like getting the state to push local cities, but then oftentimes, if you zoom out even further, like all the crazy stuff happening out of DC and their efforts to prevent. I never thought I'd be, such a huge proponent of states' rights until 2016. But again, like when you have a larger government entity telling a local community what to do, it can sometimes be a great thing, right? Like when the feds intervened and forced states to end segregation. But it can also be a really horrible thing, right? Like the whole debate around deployment of the National Guard around the border, that kind of stuff, or eliminating environmental protections, right? And so there's always that balance. And again, it goes back to like, what's the motivation of the resistance? And when I say the resistance, I'm talking like NIMBYs and neighborhood opposition, right? Is it reasonable? Is it something that we can address and come to a compromise? Or is it just like way out there, right? So I'm always like cautious about like when we talk about streamlining at the state level and taking away local control, the negative consequences and the precedents it sets for other things that we may actually really care about.
Mike?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree that there's nothing uniquely good or bad about local control or state preemption. It sort of depends on the cause it's put to. I think that empirically, in California, local control has kind of failed a test. That we've used it to prevent a lot of housing, and particularly prevent a lot of housing in affluent areas where now we use land really inefficiently to the detriment of a lot of renters. And so I think that, in that case, there is a compelling state interest. Like, it's in the state's interest to make its localities build more housing, more subsidized housing, more permanent supportive housing, more market rate housing. That can still be done badly, right? You don't have to like every aspect of SB 827, for instance, to understand that, like, and I will say this, like, compared to a lot of local governments, Los Angeles does a pretty good job. Like, we're focused on LA because we're sitting in it, but if you look at other cities in the county and other cities in the region, like, LA is sort of the heat sink for housing. I mean, it's doing a lot of the work. And so, there is a case for having the state, at least the specter of state intervention, sort of nudge the local governments to do the right thing. But I completely agree, and I would never argue that it's just a good thing to have the states run roughshod over local governments. Like, it's a case-by-case thing.
I work with the social justice organization in South Los Angeles, and so we very much are in the real world, the real world of sort of the streets of South LA and Boyle Heights and Chinatown, so I'm not like coming out of, some sort of fancy office somewhere. And we are seeing gentrification on the ground every day that is the result of new development. I understand that's different from the West Side, but it has a really pernicious effect on a lot of the low-income communities. And it's been very hard to push back on that because, while I think labor unions in low-income communities of color can be defined as special interests, they're, we're not that special. There's tons of us, right? I mean, real special interests are sort of corporations, wealthy individuals, and going to the democracy topic that we, this symposium's organized around, say what you want about ballot measures, they're more democratic than having a very few people with a lot of wealth make decisions, which has been the alternative in Los Angeles a lot of times. And so, given that this is the situation we're in, but given also that people have been very critical of the way those ballot measures levy individual sort of fees and fines and this and that on developers, I kind of like to go back to what Ann Sewell mentioned, is that we have the money to fix this problem. We have a massive problem, but we're just spending the money on the wrong people. And to what you said, Professor Manville, about like, it can't just be this, it has to be a giant, vast public subsidy. So my question for you guys is, where is that money coming from? What are the mechanisms you're seeing for generating that kind of investment into the housing that we need?
Mechanisms I'm seeing or that I would like to see? I mean, I'm not seeing a lot. Like to see, yeah. So I mean, where to start? So Ann mentioned both at the state and the national level, there's the mortgage interest deduction. I mean, that should be removed for sure. That's a terrible policy. I think at the state level, I mean even a more modest reform is just that you can now take a mortgage interest deduction on your vacation home. That's appalling, right? Like, that should be removed. That money could go into any number of state programs. Right now, the state has a renter's tax credit, which is ridiculously small. It could easily be blown up sort of like in an EITC style, like pegged to your income, and you could get a bigger rebate on your rent. At the local level, as I mentioned, of course, yes, Proposition 13 is the bogey person here, and it's a big obstacle, but we have overridden it before and we can override it again. There should be taxes one way or another on property wealth, right? Prop HHH is a model for that. You could have a pure sort of land value tax. My colleagues and I have proposed dramatically escalating the tax on real estate transactions, even just real estate transactions over $1 million. If you sell a house for over $1 million today, a lot of that profit you're clearing is not the result of your hard work. It's not because you redid your kitchen. It's because we didn't build any housing in the last 20 years. That money could go into affordable housing. There are many more real estate transactions every year than there are developments. It would raise a ton of money for affordable housing. There's lots of ways to do it.
I would say too, again, there's two initiatives to expand Prop 13. Vote against them. So 72 on the ballot in 2 weeks, and then the California Association of Realtors is proposing something for potentially November, but I think they're negotiating a deal to put it on March of 2020. Vote against those. I would say too, like, we can talk about, property taxes on $1 million homes, but part of the problem is the way our, capital gains is taxed, especially for commercial entities, right? A lot of times you can, like, let's say Brad LLC, right, sells to me, Sissy LLC, a company that owns like $1 million home or a $10 million home because I'm buying the company and not the home. That doesn't trigger a reassessment of Prop 13. right? And so closing that loophole alone, right? Like, who is it that bought some hotel in Santa Monica that saved 25 million? Huh? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Even if we kind of talk about the $1 million home, it's like the corporate taxes, again, capital gains, the fact that, you know, Dell pays 15% and me as an income wage earner pays 40%.
I agree with you about the split roll, but I like a cautionary tale about the split roll is like if that's passed, that could give local governments even less incentive to permit housing, because suddenly they'd make a lot more money off their commercial development. So I just want to just put that out there. It's not an unambiguous good.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to say there's been a lot of talk about the council office. I'm a representative from Councilmember Rue's office. I'm their senior planning deputy, so thanks for pushing it back to the council office so often. I think one of my questions really, we talk a lot about NIMBYs, or there's a lot of discussion in housing about the NIMBYs, and you know, I've only been in my job for about a month and a half now, but you know, I go out and I see communities, and I don't think that a single NIMBY that I've met doesn't have a legitimate concern about loss of control or fear about change that isn't somewhere at the base of it. And one of the things that I think I struggle with, and I think everyone in this room struggles with, the rich people, or perhaps people with more time on their hands, have the ability to be present in the room. They can take the time off. I'm asked to be simultaneously in 3 different meetings usually at the same time every week, twice a week. You know, I have to go to the zoning administrator, I have to go to the city planning commissioner, cultural commissioner, and I also have to be present for city council. So I'm lucky that I have resources. I have staff, I have 2 cell phones, I have a city car I can make access to. Residents in communities, I think, are dealing a lot of times with sort of construction and design allergy, where they've been asked to accommodate these schedules. So I hear what you're saying about kind of streamlines, but I think one of the questions that I would ask is, has anyone ever really seen a great model where community engagement has been used early in the process to kind of overcome it before the hearing? I think, generally speaking, what I've been seeing with residents is that the hearing is kind of the shots fired. That's when they know that construction's coming. That's when they know they have to engage with the design. That's when they have to start taking time off work and be present. And for low-income communities, for renters, that's just massively, it's a huge barrier. I mean, I don't know that there's a better system. It's a democracy is the best system we have, but there should be better ones. But for developers, I would pose this question. If you're proposing a streamlined process, how will you make sure there's community engagement? Because I don't know that necessarily night meetings is what I love doing, but it seems like it's one of the few ways that residents can actually provide design input and a conversation about the construction impacts, which in the life of a building, construction is a blip. In the life of a human, construction is a 2 to 3 year process, and there might be multiple projects going on. So I'm just kind of curious about which have handled that.
Well, it goes back to that comment about communication going out in the community earlier. We just had met with Councilman Rue a couple of weeks ago. We received approval for a very large development at 6th and Vermont, the new Department of Mental Health Services development for the County of Los Angeles. We started 2 years ago with community outreach, and we had multiple meetings in the community at multiple times, both at lunchtimes and in the evenings and on weekends, to address the concerns of the neighborhood. We received a unanimous approval from the Korean Neighborhood Council in Koreatown, which was the first for a major project of that size and scale. So it goes back. We do classify ourselves, I think, as different than a lot of developers. We're a publicly owned company, wholly owned subsidiary of CBRE, so it's part of our obligation as a public company to make sure we're doing what we think is right in the community. But you know, in LA, we have a lot of very private, high net worth entrepreneurial families from all over the world that come from countries that have different approaches to the way that they conduct their business. And unfortunately, the development community and those people that operate differently than what we think are the larger publicly traded companies, it's just a different approach. And unfortunately, that lumps into the overall developer of, the opinions of developers in the community.
Let me just add as well, is that as a land use practitioner working with developers like Brad and others, we often talk about streamlining the process, and folks read that to mean, no public input, circumventing the requirements. And what we talk about is certainty, and having a clarity of the process and having an expectation that if you do certain things, the government will respond accordingly. And unfortunately, that is not always the case. We talked about the abuse of CEQA, which is one component of it, but there's also a lot of other pieces of the work that we do on a daily basis with the planning department and other departments that is very challenging and results in additional delay, that results in additional costs, which creates, frankly, an incentive to create a certain kind of product in the city of LA that could be prevented or at least addressed by having a clearer process. I'll give you an example. The redevelopment agencies, as you all know, were abolished in 2012, 2011, and ultimately, started the dissolution process in 2012. The city of LA has not taken a comprehensive step to address the fact that a lot of the redevelopment plans are still in place. So think about that. We have over 30 redevelopment plans in the city of LA, including the community plans. The redevelopment plans are technically still in effect. You have an agency that's been abolished for the past 5 years that doesn't have the authority to authorize consistency approvals, determinations under their plans, and the city has not taken the steps to rectify, assume responsibility over those plans, and actually have the ability to certify a project's consistency with those plans. What does that do? It creates a weakness in the, a weakness in the cog in terms of getting these projects adopted. And the reality is that the city, over the course of a 30-year period, has relied on these redevelopment plans to do comprehensive planning. And it hasn't taken the right steps and hasn't taken its own responsibility in saying, you know what, we're going to do the right thing by these communities that are, as you know, redevelopment plans apply to low-income minority communities. Do the right thing and actually do good planning and take the steps to enforce those redevelopment plans. So that's just one example of the kinds of issues that we're dealing with that have nothing to do with circumventing the community process, that have to do with the lack of clarity and the lack of certainty in the entitlement permitting process.
I want to thank this panel very much. I think frequently when we put together panels, frequently they're stacked one direction, so I think it's important to make sure that we get all sides represented, and we will try to do that in the future as well. But obviously these are huge issues. They're not going away. They're going to be here for decades probably, and so I would just encourage you all to look out for future programs. We will continue to do these types of symposium. And we also put about a number of white papers and publications and research out of the UCLA Ziman Center for Real Estate, which I think also helps inform these issues as well. So we will look forward to seeing you at the next symposium, and thank you very much for your attendance.